Hello everyone, I'm Kevin, otherwise known as Forum BX257, here to bring another 1980s G.I. Joe tour review, and today I'll be taking a look at the G.I. Joe Communications Officer, the 1982 Breaker. I'll also be taking a look at the 1983 Swivel Arm Battle Grip version of this figure, as best as I can, because I only have the 82 version sealed on the card, and the 83 version loose. Now, Breaker makes his first comic book appearance in the old Marvel comic run, like a lot of 1982 characters, in G.I. Joe issue number 1. And makes his first cartoon appearance in the 1983 5-part miniseries, G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, in part 1. He's actually kind of most memorable as being sort of clean-shaven and always chewing bubblegum and blowing bubbles in the comic book. But in the cartoon, he had a beard on, just like his action figure version. As a matter of fact, there is a bit more to his comic book appearances, but I'll actually put that down in the description. I believe Breaker is kind of an odd code name. As a matter of fact, I think the term is sort of slipped into obscurity now, because Breaker, or more accurately Breaker, is more of a CB radio term meaning to sign on to a channel. Like, Breaker, this is BJ and the Bear. Well, I think that's dated me horribly, but you get the point. Breaker here comes with his TV radio backpack. I believe this also came with a printer in the comic books. And it has a hole so you can plug in his headset. This headset which is attached to his helmet. The headset isn't actually mentioned by itself on the contents list of the card though, which is kind of strange. The wire is permanently attached to the back. And of course he comes with his helmet, the sort of same standard helmet that you got with a lot of the 1982 figures, which has ear holes as well for the headset. But ear holes were also kind of standard, whether the helmets had anything to attach to them or not back then. Now, there were actually several differences between the 1982 versions of the figures and the 1983 versions. 1983 version of Breaker, like a lot of the card figures, was also reissued in 1984 as well. But besides the much larger waist on the 82 versions, of course these versions are considered swivel arm battle grip versions, and that's because of the arm construction. When they were first released in 1982, while they could bend at the shoulders and at the elbows, they didn't have any bicep articulation, so it was really hard for them to hold weapons and accessories in a two-handed grip, which is kind of more natural. So then they made these figures, which did the same thing, bent at the elbow and the shoulder and all that, but had this articulation point at the bicep, which allowed them to cross their arms and, hold things two-handedly. So that was the second thing. But the third thing is that, oddly enough, they had actually changed the mold of the back chest. So the hole, which is where the backpacks usually go, is actually a bit different than the ones on the 1982 version. And thus the backpacks often had different styles of pegs. Now this is going to be a little hard to demonstrate because this, again, is, in the package. But the 1983 pegs are actually kind of a bit longer and sort of rounded at the ends, whereas the pegs on the 82 versions were actually a bit stubbier. As a matter of fact, I would actually call that maybe like a quarter of an inch, versus the 83 versions of the peg which were more like a half an inch. And of course, I think a better example of this would be a straight arm version. being just sort of like almost flat at the top, with a tip rather, and the 83 version being kind of a bit longer. Of course, you can't really put an 83 version in the back of an 82 version. It doesn't really want to go in all that much. If you put an 82 version in the back of an 83 version, it goes in way too much and doesn't really stay in. Breaker was replaced by the 1986 communications specialist dial tone, at least on the toy shelves. I don't recall Breaker even being in the 1986 season of the cartoon, but I don't get the impression that he was kind of replaced in that regard. He certainly wasn't replaced in the comic books, as these two actually did have a long stint well into the later years of the original Marvel comic run, at least until issue number 109, where Dial Tone had no choice but to replace Breaker. Breaker's title of Communications Officer. Now, as you can see on his file card, he has a pay grade of E4, which is equivalent to, I guess, a corporal or a specialist in the Army. So he is by no means an Army officer. However, his title of Communications Officer is actually honorary. It just means that he is in charge, he's the infantryman in charge of communications within his squad. That's all it means. It's kind of like a safety officer for a building. They're not really an officer, and you don't call them sir, obviously. They're just in charge of, fire drills and making sure that people get proper EMS treatment and stuff like that. Although Breaker doesn't come with any weapons, because of his sort of generic infantryman outfit, he looks great on military-style vehicles, especially the ones that didn't originally come with drivers. As a matter of fact, I believe Breaker was heavily advertised back in the day with the G.I. Joe Ram motorcycle, even though in the comic books it was actually Rock and Roll who was often promoted with this. Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind-the-scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then.